Welcome to this little preview video for the importance of being earnest. And I'm aware that the word Victorian covers a lot of ground. It's 1837 to 1901, so it's not as if each decade during her reign was exactly the same and offered the same societal beliefs and anxieties. But this is really just meant, this video is meant to just create some context, particularly social context, so that when we're watching characters become emotional about certain things during the importance of being earnest, we might have a glimmer into why. My two main sources really are this great book by Daniel Poole, What Jane Austen Ate and Charles Dickens Knew. And it really dives deeply into the sort of societal little habits of the Victorians. And in Jane Austen's case, the Regency period. So it kind of walks you through a lot of the 19th century. Victorianweb.net is amazing. Those are my two main sources. Some of these will have completely direct connections to the importance of being earnest in a more overt way, and I'll talk about that. Okay. I think it's important before we look at what looks to be sometimes silly, unintentionally silly, with earnest, why people are reacting the way they are when someone can't make dinner, or someone chooses this music rather than that, or someone introduces themselves in a certain way or uses a certain phrase. Um, I think it isn't a bad thing, first, to have honest journaling and conversations if you're in a class or a reading group about what's the etiquette in our life. I think often we think we're above it now, and that things like societal etiquette is a sort of quaint memory of a bygone generation. Um, but I don't know. I teach at a high school, and baseball's in the playoffs right now. Well, they all get to the field early, dressed a certain way, not in their full uniforms yet. And there's certain stretches and certain kinds of interactions that take place. And sometimes the coach is involved and sometimes not. And will there be interactions with the other team beforehand? And I think my son is in the arts and drama. There's an etiquette to how dramatic rehearsals and performances go. I think there's an etiquette in each individual workplace that's its own thing. I think families have etiquette. So I think it's good to be upfront and honest about the fact that every context we're in has sort of unwritten rules. And one of the jobs of reading any work of imaginative literature, but I think particularly Ernest, that largely relies on either obeying or breaking these rules of etiquette, is just to be aware that these are just a different set of rules. But the notion of etiquette rules isn't a foreign one to any of us. All right, so there's 10 I'm going to go over. The first one involves fashion. So this is to heighten the sort of hourglass figure of women when they were trying to attract a husband. So you have corsets, but you also have crinolines. Probably the most ridiculous item of Victorian women's wardrobe. It's as a substitute for layers of heavy petticoats, they were wide, steel constructed, domed cages that held the skirts, as you can see here, far from the women's legs. Um, Also, it made it easier for women to use the chamber pot to go to the bathroom. Um, but maneuvering in small, cramped spaces obviously became a challenge if you were, 6 feet wide with your dress. They had to relearn how to sit elegantly. Um, but it was really popular. Every upper class woman had one of these. Um, so anyway, that's number one. That's a commitment to fashion right there. That's how badly you wanted a partner, as you would, I guess, extend your dress 6 feet. Okay, in terms of street etiquette, greeting one another and cutting. So there were really strict guidelines that governed social interactions on promenades. We have, junior, senior prom, on promenades and public streets, especially between the sexes. So a really obvious thing that's really important when you read any work of literature from this time period. A young unmarried woman could not go out without an escort out in society. She wouldn't just go to Starbucks or the equivalent thereof. Etiquette forbade young ladies actually from, looking around for friends or stopping to chat in a crowd when she saw someone she knew. All of this was prohibited. Um, there's a household guide called Cassell's Household Guide. That's a really important resource for things like this. And it was published in 1869. So that's about 10 or 15 years after Wilde was born. And in that book, it says if a young woman did see a gentleman friend and felt that it would be inappropriate to ignore him, she'd have to take the initiative and offer her own hand. And the gentleman had to wait for the lady to recognize him before lifting his hat, and not simply touching the brim, but lifting his hat. He had to use the hand farthest from her. That was the appropriate thing. If she offered her hand, the gentleman had to turn and walk with the lady instead of stopping. But most importantly, the conversation had to be very reserved. So very strict conduct had to be observed. Nothing loud, nothing animated, and nothing with a lot of strong opinions. So it had to remain somewhat superficial. And Oscar Wilde plays on that when I believe it's Algie who comments on the weather, and Cecily said, "Oh, don't talk about the weather." When anybody ever talks about the weather, I presume they actually want to talk about something else. Gentlemen never smoked in the presence of a woman, and a woman, it would be inappropriate for a woman to talk to a guy while smoking, because then he might have to put out an expensive cigar. That's kind of funny. And then only under extreme circumstances could you perform the practice of cutting. And cutting is when you stare directly at someone you knew with no sign of recognition. And in Cassell's Household Guide, it says this is the most ill-mannered act possible to commit in society. So to look at someone you knew and not really acknowledge them. In a carriage ride, a gentleman never sat next to a lady who was not a relative. So he always sat with his back to the horses, allowing the opposite seat to the lady. A gentleman also had to take care not to step on a lady's dress, and he had to get out of the carriage first to help her down. So it was just a landmine, a set of landmines of problems, right? All these etiquette rules. Okay, and then in terms of addressing all the different ranks of nobility, to really be a legitimate member of society and to rise in society, you had to know how to interact, and you had to know the hierarchy really, really well, and the gradations of the hierarchy. That had to do with how we introduced each other. So it was considered improper to address someone that you hadn't been presented to yet. You wouldn't just walk up to someone and say, "Hey, I'm Jay. How are you?" Social inferiors, if you were lower socially, you had to wait to be presented to social superiors in a societal context. So with the exception that ladies were, no matter what, always introduced to gentlemen, no matter what the rank was. So to introduce people, as if you were a proper Victorian and you wanted to introduce someone, you had to know your social rankings, or what's called, this is important, the order of precedence. And there was a lot of degrees. So you had the sovereign, in this case Queen Victoria, and then the sovereign's close relations, so they're first. Then the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord High Chancellor. And there were really two after that. You probably weren't going to be at a lot of parties with the Queen and her family. But after that, there was the peerage, Peerage, and that was like dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons, and in that order, by the way. And then below them, baronets, knights. So properly addressing the nobility was hard too, because usually you'd use lord to address any of those peers, dukes, marquises, earls. Lady, you would say to address women married to a peer, and then sir to address baronets and knights. But to make it more confusing was the use of lord and lady to address upper class people who were not nobility as like a courtesy title. This was also opposed to written communication because one had to know that a marquise was addressed as the most honorable, while other peers were addressed as the right honorable. So again, so many things. But I think of like the House and the Senate. You know, there's all these different titles. So anyway, um, calling card etiquette. This appears in various plays by Oscar Wilde. If you arrived in London for an extended visit, it was normal to go around and leaving your calling card, and that was a way to announce that you were there, and you could arrange for visits with old friends. So the person receiving your card would return the favor in the form of a card or a visit within a week. So intimate friends could call right away without even waiting for a card. And you could also leave cards for a household during certain events like illness or engagements. Like if you wanted to express sorrow that someone passed away or congratulations they were engaged, you would leave your card. A really fine lady would go around in her carriage with a footman, and the footman would do the work of bringing her card in homes, and he'd bring a lot. So one married woman calling on another would bring one card with her name and two with her husband's name, in addition to cards for unmarried daughters or guests, and the names of the visitor's unmarried daughters could be written on the mother's card. So this became, and you see this in some of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens, like an almost a societal competition, like how many visitors are you getting? You know, it's just a popularity contest. You know, it's like people liking your posts on social media. In terms of when those calls happen, when a visit was accepted or arranged, you weren't supposed to wear anything showy. So you were supposed to wear a plain sort of walking costume, and they were known as morning calls, morning. But they were really never performed before noon. Morning in the Victorian age meant any time before dinner, like before 7 p.m. So I know most of my teenage students that I teach would love for that to be true. Every day, if a woman was home, she was expected to be dressed and ready for visitors between 3 and 5 p.m. And the closer you were to someone, the later you could visit. And someone not really known well to you would visit her closer to 3. And if they kind of messed that up, that was seen as ill taste. When you got there, the butler would lead you to like a common room or a drawing room where people would receive their guests. Gentlemen would bring their hat and riding whip with them, their riding whip for their horse, to imply that they weren't going to stay for hours and hours and hours. As an act of courtesy, the gentleman would keep his hat in his hand, unless it was necessary to put it on the furniture, but would never put it on a chair or the floor. Shaking hands wasn't to be done super firmly. You can almost see in this picture like he's holding her hand, but it's supposed to be a gentle pressure that was seen as appropriate. And visits were only 15 to 20 minutes, and you would be served tea. Now, this is where it gets crazy. So dinner party etiquette. This was the real minefield of possible social problems. First of all, the guests were required to arrive 15 minutes late. So if you're congenitally late, you would have loved the Victorian period. So after you gather in the drawing room for a little while, a servant would announce you to enter for dinner. But moving just to the dinner table wasn't a self-evident set of choices. It was a very carefully planned procession of couples that went in hierarchical order from highest rank to lowest. And the hostess would organize the order of procession and who was sitting next to whom. And it was always, woman, man. The hosts, man and woman, would be on either side of the table. It gets complicated if you think about it when one's guests included single people or widows and widowers, because that actually would by necessity alter who you could invite and how many of them. So getting the procession wrong, the order wrong, would make for a really difficult night The meal was often about 10 courses long, several hours. And during the meal, you would, for the first half, talk to the person to your right. And then the host would say switch or change, and you'd talk to the person on your left. Um, and then after dinner, the women and the men would separate, right? The ladies would go and drink coffee or tea, and the men would go in a separate room and smoke and, tell their stories. Now, if you were fortunate, you maybe even presented at St. James Court. When a girl was presented at court, she transformed when she was out. And we see that in Pride and Prejudice, which is, 100 or so years, no, not 100 years, about 80-ish years before Importance of Being Earnest. But the notion of a girl being out meant she is publicly available for a possible marriage proposal. And when you were presented at court, you went from being underage and off limits to suddenly being marriageable. Girls were presented several times a year at St. James Palace. Men were also presented several times a year as well. This was a big formal event. Very strict rules outlined what you could wear when you were presented at court. Men wore knee breeches, buckle shoes, and wielded a sword. Interesting. Ladies had to wear feathers in their hair high enough for the queen to see. And the train of their dress needed to measure 3 yards, 2.74 meters long exactly. We can dig into why this is. It's just interesting. Although the Victorians had a reputation for modesty, the dress for presentation with the sword and the feathers and everything did also leave a lady's neck and much of her shoulders bare. So that was kind of a big deal. Ladies had to carry their trains on their arm while waiting in the palace to be presented. Several lords in waiting were there to lay out a lady's train and to pass along her card to announce her to the queen herself. She would enter, and the lady would kiss the queen's hand, or maybe she then needed to wait for a page to place her train on her left arm again before she somehow managed to elegantly exit the room without turning her back to the queen. This is almost more highly choreographed than any dance you'll see on a stage. The young men's presentation was similar. A man would be announced, would bend down on one knee, hold out his right hand to the queen. Queen would lay her hand on his, and he would kiss it. And after this, you could go look for a mate if you, I guess, had the energy or knew where your sword was. In terms of courtship etiquette, this again, big in Oscar Wilde, the whole idea of the season and being marriageable. In Cassell's book that I was mentioning earlier, it says marriages of affection are not necessarily incompatible with marriages formed from interested motives, which is code for money. But mutual affection is not considered necessary as a starting point. And I think this is really, really important, and I think it presents one of the significant gaps between a modern reader and a reader of 19th century texts in general. And I know that's a big, broad, sweeping generalization, but it's a relatively new idea that people choose their partners in life. And we're getting a sense in Earnest, in Importance of Being Earnest, that you have young people fighting for that kind of independent choosing of their life partners, with the oxygen around them. In this play, mainly Lady Bracknell, the oxygen around them is more deterministic and looks at marriage more as a set of financial obligations. And I would argue much of the comedy of The Importance of Being Earnest is the tension between the previous generation's sense that marriage is a business contract and the modern, younger generation's sense that marriage needs to be a love match. And the tension there creates both the drama, I would argue, and the comedy. Now, etiquette books of the day said that you were supposed to only look in your own class for a mate. Read this play carefully. There's some surprising exceptions to that. And the common law customs in my Pride and Prejudice video has more on this regarding entail, like who gets the money when a home without a son, when the father dies, and primogenitor, the notion that the oldest son gets everything. Um, these sort of things, these sort of financial limitations get in the way of marrying for love, which is why eldest sons who would inherit everything are the most desirable. And so the other thing that comes up in Earnest is the men are older than the women. It was normal for a 30-year-old man to marry a woman who was in her early 20s, and maybe a 40-year-old man, a woman in her late 20s. Um, and what would happen is girls would be in town during the season, which is really like April, May, and June. And this was like a marriage market. There'd be all these formal events where girls would kind of display themselves. And what Poole says is that if a girl wasn't married within 3 seasons, she pretty much should prepare herself for a life of a single person. That she'd be seen as sort of hopeless. Um, Now, if a gentleman was interested in a lady, he could never date her or be alone with her. He'd call on her at her family's home. They would talk in the presence of her parents or maybe chaperones. Um, and they'd be reading each other's character the whole time. And a woman would be very cautious around a man who enjoyed um, what Poole says, low and vulgar amusements, while a man would want to make sure his wife, future wife, made good company, good conversation, and that she performed her household duties. All right, a couple more. Ballroom etiquette. Now, a ball is different than a country dance. We saw this in Jane Austen. And a ball, the dress is more formal and stylized, and you have an orchestra, and the dances are more intricate. So um, you get an invitation weeks in advance for this. There was a long dinner, there was card playing, there was music, there was dancing, um, and the house was really prepared. So you don't really see this in Importance of Being Earnest, but this is a woman and man's capacity to be fluid and knowledgeable in the way of being in a room like this, knowing how to introduce and how to be introduced, knowing when and where to interact with the opposite sex, knowing how to make the correct sort of strategic small talk. All of those things ended up at their height at the ball. And then, how do you finally propose? What does that look like? When a Victorian gentleman wants to propose, he figures out as best he can what the woman feels, and then he has to seek a blessing from the woman's father before the engagement's official. Um, and assuming that everything worked out and that the families all agree that this is a good idea, engaged people had to really behave themselves before the marriage. The lady would still be with him with chaperones, and she would never go out alone, even when they were formally engaged. The couple can't retreat from a group to whisper together or to do anything that, quote, excites smiles or comments from other people. Um, so everything, they're so cautious. There's so much at stake that even rumor could get in the way of this working. I know this is somewhat peculiar, but I hope some of these helped you appreciate the sort of strange and awesome and interesting world of Importance of Being Earnest. Good luck and happy reading.